knee replacement. I recommend it, sort of. Anyway, it takes a while. Thank you very much, Senator. It's great to be with you. I will just be an addendum here, a footnote to what's been said already, because most important things have been said already. In addition, I am told I stand between you and your lunch, so you have to wonder whether I savor my words more than the thought of you savoring your lunch. But take comfort, my words stand between me and my lunch too. So we're in the same boat. Thank you, Lisa. Thanks for the invitation. It's a very important session. I'm here as chairman of Conservative Leaders for Education, and we've been deeply involved in this issue. I prepared remarks, but let me just hit the highlights, because again, like I said, you've heard the most important things already. Just one thing to my hero, Mark Janus. Mark, that's too much of your mortality is on your mind. It's resting too heavy on you. We will know where you are years from now, unlike Jimmy Hoffa. We will be able to locate you, find you, visit with you, and so on. So tell Mom that's fine, and you'll be around as these cases wind up. Look, first point on that, and I'm glad Senator Kelsey brought this up, and I'm glad he's working where he's working, because we're going to get some bad decisions on this at lower court levels, as you see in the whole immigration debate. You get a single judge saying this and that. The Supreme Court has to remind a judge occasionally that he's mistaken. I am of the same orientation bent as most of you in regard to Washington, but occasionally good things do happen in Washington. If you get a good Supreme Court, that's a very, very good thing. And we have a good Supreme Court, even a little better Supreme Court, I believe, than we had at the time of the Janus decision. Yep, I agree. I want to sort of drill down on the education part of this, the teaching part of this, because I think it's most important to me as an educator, someone who was the Secretary of Education. And I'm glad, Senator, you heard my remarks. You were in high school. I was in college, I think, when I made those. You said the Charlie Rose show. Who is Charlie Rose? I can't even remember who Charlie Rose is. Anyway, we don't get into that. But I think of Janus and the decision. Mark, by the way, you're famous now. You know that. You know, your first name or last name is Versus, and it's a very big deal. The 3 Ps, and let me tell you what they are. There's the premise of Janus, namely, coerced political speech is wholly incompatible with the First Amendment. This was loud and clear from the court, Justice Alito for the majority. Coerced political speech is wholly incompatible with the First Amendment. The second P is the prohibition of Janus, the now to be court enforced ban. You cannot take funds from employees absent clear evidence of affirmative consent. Affirmative consent. You can't assume consent. You can't assume lack of consent. You must have evidence of affirmative consent. That is, that individual teacher or public employee must say, yes, I want to do this. You can, I'll pay these dues. Now, this prohibition is already being frustrated. I didn't know that California was putting this thing into place the very day that the court decision came down. I was following Maryland, where the Attorney General issued guidance, supposed guidance, for all impacted employees, saying the decision really did not change anything at all. Attorney General said this decision didn't change anything at all. In his advisory, the Attorney General wrote, in other words, the decision in Janus does not alter any pre-existing obligation of a public employer to deduct dues from union members. That's just wrong. It's just flat false. You're going to see that. You're going to see things like that all over the place. In Pennsylvania, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a second, in several other states, legislation has been proposed that purports to create tight windows for when employees may exercise their Janus right, notwithstanding it impossible to square such limitations with the opt-in and clear affirmative consent foundations of the decision. Again, legislation that purports to create tight windows for when employees may exercise their rights. Can't do that. You have to have evidence of affirmative consent. Thankfully, some of the organizations we're working with, the Conservative Leaders for Education, have filed litigation in states against these purported Janus windows. Let me jump ahead. One other I want to mention is New York, via a new executive order. Only unions can receive the contact information of employees. I mean, that's just crazy. That's just wrong. No other entity can receive that information. This action was on the heels of legislation signed into law that purports to give only employees 10 days every year in which they may exercise their Janus First Amendment rights. You do not have a 10-day limit on the exercise of your First Amendment rights. Let that be said loud and clear. Okay, it's not just 10 days a year. Is this the day I can exercise my First Amendment rights? No, you got to wait another month. They're there all the time. So those are some of the obstacles. We will see more, as the panel just said. We're going to see more litigation. We're going to see more efforts to stop. So it requires pushback. Flannery O'Connor, one of my favorite authors, says sometimes you have to push back as hard as the age that pushes against you. And there will be pushback from the union organizations on this issue. But the third P, after the premise and the prohibition, that I really want to talk about is what I call the promise of Janus. And the promise of Janus has to do, if you allow me just to talk about education for a minute, with what I think this might occasion in the teaching profession and what I'm hoping it will occasion in the teaching profession. Because teaching was once a profession, and teachers regarded themselves as professionals. And we talked about teachers in the way that Senator Kelsey talked about his mom, with this kind of respect and regard. And they thought of themselves differently in many cases. They did not think of themselves as a cog in some large collective enterprise. They thought of themselves, remember Thomas More, in A Man for All Seasons, he says to Richard Rich, who's interested in becoming a political type, he says, "Rich, be a teacher." And Rich says, "If I were, who would know it?" He said, "You, your students, and God, not a bad public that." It's a pretty good argument. It's that exalted notion of teaching. Many teachers today still have that notion, but there's a collective mentality sense that's brought about by a lot of the union organizations and the efforts and the recent history that has changed teachers' thoughts of themselves, their very notion of what it means to be a teacher. An example in Pennsylvania, and I just want to highlight it here, Senator Eichelberger, whom you've heard from before, I think this morning, many of you, we were honored to go up and testify before his committee. This is excellent legislation, model legislation that he has proposed, and you should take a look at it. During the course of that testimony, we talked about a situation, I think it was in Abingdon School District, where teachers received notification from one of the bosses that said, "No more writing letters of recommendations for students for college. It's not in the contract. We don't have an agreement on it, so stop doing it." To sever that relationship between a teacher and a student, a teacher who knows a student, who wants to get behind that student, who wants to support that student, now being told not to do it. That's just the kind of cut against the notion of professionalism that is too much in evidence today. So I am hoping that the Janus decision will, not right away, but in time, free people from that understanding of themselves, cog in a collective machine, a large machine, and think of themselves again as professionals. So I call it the decision, the freedom and professional responsibility decision. Now, there's work to be done on this, obviously, and you're the ones to do it. Legislation to be put forward, anticipating these obstacles, because there will be many of them, and giving a voice to this better notion. But again, I just want to stress, we don't have to just be saying, well, this is anti-union. The decision was not anti-union, as was made clear by our friend and colleague Terry Pell from the Center for Individual Rights. The decision was neutral as to whether you're pro-union or anti-union. The decision is pro-teacher and pro-teacher decision and pro-teacher's First Amendment rights. And again, that's the thing we want to underscore, and that's the thing we want to advance. So we urge you to take a look at what's happened in Pennsylvania and some other states. There's a lot of expertise in this room. Get girded for a fight, because it's going to take place. But this was a huge decision, and I think a huge decision for the cause of individual liberty. It will now be fought out on the ground in the places you know best. And we encourage you to look to these models, to look to these men and women who have already stood up for it and to advance the ball. But my hope is that we will also encourage in this moment teachers to begin to think of themselves in a different way, in a better way, in a more ennobling way, in a more exalted way, to remember why they entered the profession in the first place. That would be a great delivery on the promise of Janus. Mark, thank you for what you've done. Senator, thank you. Thank you all in the room for what you've done to advance this. Thanks very much.